I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight to partake in this event with one of Canada's much celebrated authors. Koe kakina, hello everyone. We believe it is important to acknowledge that even as we gather virtually, we are on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people now live, work, and study in this territory. Nous rendons hommage à toutes les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis, leurs aînés, leurs ancêtres et leurs importantes contributions passées et présentes. On behalf of the library, I want to thank our partner in this event, the Ottawa International Writers Festival, for bringing us such a fantastic array of authors to enjoy this fall. Thank you. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome two-time Scotiabank Giller Prize winner, Esi Edugyan, for a conversation about her latest book, Out of the Sun, on race and storytelling, which is part of the CBC's Massey Lecture Series for 2021. In it, she explores the relationship between art and race, challenging accepted versions of the Black experience with new perspectives. If you haven't read it yet, you will soon be able to borrow Out of the Sun at a library branch near you, and you can check out her other highly acclaimed books, Washington Black and Half-Blood Blues. Just as an aside, Washington Black was nominated in 2020 by OPL and other libraries and shortlisted for the Dublin Literary Award. That is huge. Congratulations. One more accolade for Esi Edugyan, one of Canada's most celebrated authors. Now, please visit the OPL website to find out about our upcoming programs, including our weekly author events in partnership with the Ottawa International Writers Festival, and of course, to request all of Esi's books. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Sean Wilson from the Ottawa International Writers Festival to say a few words. Merci, and have a great evening. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm also broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to this conversation between two of my very favorite writers, Kagiso Lesego Molope and Esi Edugyan. I want to begin, as always, by thanking you all for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but I know wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. Festival is supported by generous individuals like you, so I hope you'll consider subscribing to our newsletter and making a donation. We can't do this without you. I also want to thank the Ottawa Public Library, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, the City of Ottawa, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, Carleton University, and CBC for their ongoing support. We've got lots of great events coming up. Tomorrow, it's Peter Mansbridge. Our guest on Thursday is Mark Critch. And Friday's podcasts will feature Booker nominee Ruth Ozeki and two-time Governor General's Award winner Jordan Tannehill. So there is lots to look forward to. Our host tonight is Kagiso Lesego Molope. She's a playwright and novelist born in South Africa. She calls Ottawa home. And since she's been here, we've been lucky enough to celebrate the publication of her two most recent novels, This Book Betrays My Brother, which won the Ottawa Book Award in 2019, and Such a Lonely, Lovely Road, which won the inaugural Pius Adesamni Memorial Award. Please give a warm virtual welcome to our host this evening, the one and only Kagiso Lesego Molope. Kagiso.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Sean. What a great introduction. Hi, Esi. I am so excited to chat with you tonight. I was just saying before you hopped on that that this felt like the book I needed. And so I feel really lucky that we get to have a conversation, or that I get to, ask you the questions that have been burning in my mind over the past 2 weeks as I've been reading it. So welcome to the Ottawa Writers Festival.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you as well. And your thoughts.
How have you been in the past year?
The past year and a half, of course, has been, I think, challenging for a lot of people. As writers, maybe I guess work-wise, we weather it a little bit better because we're working from home a lot of the time anyway. But of course, there's been, so many upheavals, and emotionally, I think it's been a fraught time for a lot of people, children included. I have 2 young kids, and so that's been it's been an interesting time, but there's been a lot of growth, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, of course, you're right. It's been really difficult for everybody. But for me, I've been in awe of writers who could actually work during this time. I found it really hard. And I was reflecting on this time as I was reading Out of the Sun, because I felt at the beginning of the lockdowns and, of course, the protests last year, I just felt like I couldn't function. And then I realized that, this was grief. I was mourning and I couldn't. And so I just sort of sat with it and I couldn't really do a lot of creative work. And as I was reading Out of the Sun, I felt really held by your book. I felt like it was the book I needed to read coming out of this time. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you did get through this time. You say in the introduction that what got you through it was the quiet dredging up of these lives from other times and the attempt to discover how, if at all, they have shaped our own. You speak of a quiet dredging up, and yet the book just feels to have such a sense of urgency to it. It just feels like it feels so powerful. In every word, in every sentence, in every page. I was wondering if you were feeling this sense of urgency as you were writing it, like you just needed to get it out, and what was happening for you emotionally as you were going through it.
I really did. It was a different writing process than all of my other books, which, of course, they're all novels, so fictions. They all took about 3 years to compose, so there was a lot of kind of very slow working with the material, and of course you're kind of constructing your own universe, so it's a very different mode. And with these pieces, I felt as though I was maybe engaging with the current in a much more direct way, which is not to say that my fiction doesn't concern itself with contemporary matters, but it's all done through the filter of the past. Mm-hmm. And I guess in this sense, I mean, there are a lot of historical stories that I'm telling, and a lot of wonderful historians that I'm leaning on to tell those stories. But it felt like, I was really trying to get a sense of what has changed over time since, since we've looked at this particular life, or for instance, writing about British Columbia, for instance, in the 1850s, and these racist murders taking place on Salt Spring Island, and really kind of assessing, how are we discussing this now? How has this become a part of our history? How has it been a suppressed, I guess, a suppressed series of events that we're not talking about? And what does that mean for us that this is not, these deaths aren't more widely known? So there was a lot of, I guess, maybe still thinking about current issues through the filter of the past, but it did feel, I started writing these pieces, I guess during the protests. We were having a lot of, I was so heartened and struck by, by these huge street protests that were happening even in Victoria, which I love Victoria, but it can feel complacent sometimes. And when we have protests, they tend to be very small. But you had thousands of people, filling Government Street, filling Douglas, and this was an incredible. It felt like an incredible shift was taking place, and something I certainly hadn't seen before in my lifetime. And so I really started to think quite deeply about what it meant, and then using these past references to sort of, I guess, ask how far we've come, how far we still have to go, these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. When the protests were happening, I remember reading an article where an Afro-European writer had given an interview, and he said, I understand what's happening with Black Lives Matter, and I understand all this rage and all this disappointment and all this hurt, but I just feel that I want to write about beauty. And it occurred to me that I was struggling with that a little bit, because I was thinking I couldn't separate beauty from the protests, because it seemed to me that just the very act of going out and demanding that you speak somebody's name is an act of love. It felt to me like this book was that as well, was an extension of that, was an extension of those protests. It felt like an act of love. And I felt like the book was rooted in that. What do you think?
I think that's the highest compliment that I could take for this book. I really love that. This idea that so much of at least for me, African Canadian history, my sense of African Canadian history growing up in Calgary, Alberta, and really having no sense of what an African Canadian history might look like, or the diversity of what those histories might look like. And so it was a kind of act of love to go back and try and trace, I guess, some of these histories that emerge out of my own life, and also that emerge out of the places that I have lived, but also to look at a sort of more global sense of Blackness and of to take stories from the diaspora that maybe we're not familiar with, or when we are familiar with them, to juxtapose them with other stories to create new meaning. Really was a process of resurrection, of creating more visibility and more space for these kinds of stories that I certainly didn't grow up having a sense of. And in a way that is a kind of act of love, I suppose, to sort of try and revivify, I guess, some of what's been lost.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it really felt like an extension of the call, say their names. During the protests, there was so much of that being said, say their names. And when I was reading your book, I felt that that you were calling out those names, and you were saying, this person lived and this person mattered. And you write with so much compassion when you write about Angela Soliman, when you write about Dido Bell, Marie-Angelique. I think that you gave me a different perspective of those stories that I'd read about these historical figures before. I had some idea of what I thought and all of that, but you add so much complexity, I think, to the story. I think it's just the fact of how much compassion you put in it that that really kind of had me stop and really appreciate them from a different place.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think just to speak to that, I think it's a little bit of the fiction writer, right? To go in and try and really try and access the thoughts or the possible thoughts of these figures, or the possible complications of what it meant to live during these eras, which is not to say that there's not some very fine writing about these figures on the record that we can go away and access, but that was my particular way of entering these stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something happened this year, in April of this year, that I found so powerful. I kept going back to it. And then, when I read your book, it came back to me when Donte Wright was killed in April, the young African-American man. When he was killed, his aunt stood in front of all of us, really, and said, he was loved, he was ours. And it was so painful for me to watch at the time. But I felt like the whole book was that. I felt like the whole book was saying they were ours, they were loved, both, in terms of the people you name and in terms of talking about unmarked graves and people who can't be remembered because they were, the graves were not, prominent or destroyed. I felt that. And this is part of why I sort of said at the beginning, this is the book I needed, because I felt very much like, and then after reading the book, then I was going back to the video and sort of feeling this sort of hug, like this, this is kind of the job. I think we need to go back and say that people were loved and they were ours and they mattered a lot more than history has said they do, or if history has taught us anything at all, which it doesn't most of the time.
Yeah. And I'm thinking in particular of the piece at the front of the book about European portraiture and all of those 18th century, 19th century portraits in which so many of the Black figures are, they're slaves, they're servants, they're often shown in these either degraded conditions or these very hyper idealized depictions of them in servitude, as though there was some happiness to be found in that condition, and that this was sort of the height to which they could aspire, and that there was personal happiness to be found in that, and so to look at some of those paintings and to try and figure out who the figures were, what were the contours of their lives, what did their days consist of, who did they love, what freedoms were they permitted and what was denied them, to try and sort of track down and locate some of the histories of the people who either were forced to sit for the portraits, or it's not even a portrait of a real person, but an idealized version of I guess of what the painter thought Blackness was. To sort of look at the circumstances of the painting and maybe give a kind of voice to those lives. I don't mean to suggest to anybody who hasn't read the book that this is a book in which, I fictionalized historical characters and they're moving through time, but just really trying to show the humanity through the known details. This felt like a reclamation to me. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's what I felt as well, that you were really in a process of honoring their humanity. I want to speaking of the paintings, I think a lot of our listeners will have heard, before I carry on, I just want to let everyone know that there will be a Q&A period. And so if you have any questions to ask, please go ahead. And I'll let you know about a couple of minutes before I start taking the questions. So speaking of the paintings, I think a lot of people listening, a lot of people who will read the book will have heard of the story of, a lot of the stories, but let's talk a little bit about Dido Bell. I think a lot of people will have heard of Dido Bell through the film that was made about her a few years ago. Mm-hmm. I was struck by your impression of the painting. I had read the original scriptwriter for the film is English West African woman. I think she's of Nigerian descent. And she talks about her first impressions of the painting when she first laid eyes on it, and she was just compelled to write about Dido and create this whole life around her. I'd be really excited if you kind of repeated, or just maybe not repeat, but just kind of briefly talk about what you were feeling when you first saw that painting and what was going through your mind.
I mean, I was struck by so many things. I come to this very grand place that just can't help but exert this force over you. It was just such a peculiar place, and I was not expecting to see the painting. Somehow, I wasn't somehow at that point aware of the story of Dido Bell. So I sort of was so surprised to see this figure she's very much in the background of this painting. It's actually kind of an awkward and strange painting, because you do feel as though it was meant to be a painting of her cousin, and that this is obviously, she's the focal point. And then you have the figure of Dido in the background, who just kind of almost like she's striding through the image on her way to elsewhere. And she's dressed, I guess we don't have an image of the painting, but for those of you who haven't seen it, so she's dressed kind of, I guess very much in the way that the manner of her cousins, in terms of her dress. But on her head, she's wearing a white turban with a feather, and she's carrying in her arms like a basket of fruit for her mistress, and she's also touching her cheek rather awkwardly as she's kind of promenading through the room. And so she cuts a very strange figure. Her dress being so close to that of what her, that the dress that her cousin is wearing, you sort of feel that signifies a certain equality in stature. But then you have these other elements. So you have the white turban, which in painting of that time was always, I guess, when you saw the turban on the head of a figure, this person was, you knew it was sort of code that this person had an innate tie to what was called the Orient. At the time, Northern Africa was considered part of what was Oriental. And so she's marked out immediately as being quite foreign, with this turban on her head. And then, she's not sort of sitting comfortably with her cousin, as you might see in a kind of dual portrait. She's passing through it, and she's holding a servant's platter. And so you're not quite, her status is something that you're instantly questioning. Is this somebody who's of equal stature? Clearly not. She's, because she has the platter of servitude, yet she's dressed in a manner that's befitting somebody of their rank. She is, she's touching her cheek, which many people have, there are differing ideas of what that's supposed to signify. But some historians have said that she's actually pointing out her color, that this is something where she's drawing attention to her skin tone, and which is further highlighting her difference. And so I found that to be utterly fascinating. And I just found myself staring at this painting for so long. And you started to wonder about her life and the life of her cousin, and really coming to understand her story, and realizing that she lived in a very complex, just a very complicated position that she occupied within the household, where she was a beloved relative and like a daughter to Lord Mansfield, who was, I guess, the highest judge of the land at that time, and who was her protector, and she was his beloved, but who also kind of occupied a murkier position, in that she wasn't invited to dine with the family, all of the time when they had company. She might be asked to take a turn about the garden after the meal, but she was never invited to kind of sit and eat as somebody who had equal stature within that household. And you had one guest who remarked, and I talk about this in the book, that he was shocked to see the women taking a turn about the garden with this dark-skinned woman, and she's walking arm in arm with her cousin Elizabeth, and he just thought that was a scandalous thing to be happening in the house of Judge Mansfield. And so you really understand that she had come from a very difficult life in which her mother had been enslaved and was taken to live in England, and was raised in a way that must have given her a very fractured sense of her own identity. It would have been so complicated, and I was really drawn to that. And I really wanted to look at that life alongside, say, the life of Angelo Solomon, and alongside, the paintings of Kehinde Wiley, and what are we seeing in all of these versions of Blackness that are, so different.
Right. Let's go back a little bit. I wanted to ask you, you do throughout the book, you take us everywhere, and you do talk a little bit about the sense of not belonging, especially when you get to the bit about returning to Ghana. Can you say what it was about your Canadian upbringing that has brought you to this moment, that has led you to this place of this moment of writing this book?
I think that's hard for me to quantify. There are just so many different strains, I guess, that brought me to the writing of this book. And for me, it never feels like a book is this deliberate undertaking. I feel like it's something that, in a sense, feels much more arcane. I often don't know what I'm setting out to write until I'm halfway through it, and I recognize, oh, this is me channeling this emotion or this part of my life. But I think, having said that, I think, having been born and raised in Calgary, I was a child of the 80s. At that time, I think, I felt quite isolated. It wasn't, I didn't live in a community that was especially diverse. And, I'd say even today, and if we're going to look at stats, the population of African Canadians in the West has never been greater than 1%. So it's always been a kind of smaller sense of community or communities that we have here. And so I think maybe I was always aware of a sense of having a story that had begun elsewhere, I suppose, but also looking for my Canadian story and the parts of my life that were intimately rooted to the place that I was, in which I was born and raised, and how that had defined me, but also seeking out, Black histories, I guess, within my own culture, and really wanting to understand what it meant to be Black and Canadian, and what it meant to be Black and Western Canadian. So there was a lot of searching. And I remember when I was writing, looking for material for my first novel, when I was in my early 20s, I remember I was living in Charlottesville with my husband because he attended the University of Virginia. This was before we married. But I remember going to this beautiful library on campus, and somehow stumbling across a history of Alberta in Charlottesville, Virginia, of all places. And I just remember opening it and seeing these images of these, Black settlers in northern Alberta at the turn of the 20th century. And these were the communities of Amber Valley. And I recognized in that moment that I really, I just felt so deracinated. I had no idea that there had been, a Black community in the northern part of the province that I had spent, my 17 years in. I was just I just couldn't believe that this was the case. And so I really, started to explore that and to research it. And that's how I came to write The Second Life of Samuel Tyne. That was a way of kind of reclaiming, I guess my, even though there wasn't a direct line of continuance, those aren't my direct ancestors. It did feel somehow something that was very grounding for me, to have a sense that there had been a community of African descent that wasn't so recent as my community, and that there was history there. And so maybe all of my books are kind of rooted in that sense of wanting to find the deep histories of the African diaspora.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm kind of excited by one aspect of your writing. I grew up in South Africa. You grew up in Canada, which is to say we both grew up in settler colonies, countries with linked histories, right? Around the story of apartheid. So, and I think when writing a book like this, the temptation is to draw this very clear separation between yourself and the colonizer and the people whose names we do not, whose lives we do not know about, and the people whose lives we do know about. But throughout the book, I noticed that you don't speak of yourself. You don't keep yourself at the margins. And of course, we know that identity is a very complex thing and, ever shifting. But I'm excited by how you always say we from the very beginning to the very end of the book. Was that deliberate? It was so exciting for me. Maybe I'm a little too excited about it, but I just, there's a lot for me in it, but I just want to hear what where you were coming from with that.
Yeah, I think I do say we, but I think the we is always shifting. I had an interview the other day in which I said we, and I was using the we of nationhood, but she was hearing the we of diaspora, and then we sort of got our wires crossed a bit, and I realized, yeah, I do sort of kind of dance around. Sometimes it is a question of citizenship and that we, or it's a question of I guess African diaspora, and it's that we, or it's the we of being African Canadian, or and this is something or the we of settlement, of which, my people were also settlers. So there is that we to claim. But, I think one of the things I was struck by in reading all of the stories that I was researching and really probing them and trying to see how they came together was this idea that the way that we've constructed race, just throughout history and in various cultures, and how ever shifting that is and has been. Thinking of the chapter in America, how racial segregation was sort of brought into law or codified through law with Plessy versus Ferguson, and where you had a man who Homer Plessy, who was a Black man, but a very light-skinned Black man, and how he he deliberately sat in the section of the streetcar reserved for white people, and he did this to kind of, he had done it, I think, just to sort of make a point that this is a construct, and there are many among you who wouldn't even recognize that I was a Black man. And he was eventually discovered, and of course it triggered a whole court case, and then but just looking at a figure like Rachel Dolezal, and this idea of transracialism, and this was her story, and as well as a few other stories were ones that were much more recent, and they're not historical stories, but looking at their stories through the lens of stories of people who I guess impersonated Black people to make a point to white people about the folly of racial prejudice. But Rachel Dolezal is somebody who feels that she's living a very authentic life as a Black woman, and yet there are so many within the Black community for whom they feel affronted by her desire to live as a Black woman. I found that fascinating. This idea that you can construct your own identity, and we feel so much. We go out in the world and we feel that we are in utter control of our identities, and this is something that we're constructing for ourselves. And but there are ways in which that this is not true. This is impossible. You can't control. Part of the construct of your identity is determined by the will of others, and that this is something that is, it's fascinating. And is it right? Is it just? What does it mean when you don't get to claim the racial identity that you feel most belongs to you? You don't get to inhabit that. So this was something that I found really interesting to write about and to think about.
Right. Yeah. It fascinates me too. My mother is a very light-skinned woman, and she, the Khoisan, where we tend to be quite light-skinned, and so under apartheid, there was always this: are you colored or are you Black? And because the two were separated. But she talks about how she would just wear wigs sometimes and would be allowed to ride second class on the train, because the coloreds could ride second class, because everyone thought she was colored. And so how she just could sort of shift that back and forth all the time, and how she, in that way, felt powerful, felt that was in her control, that she could do that for herself.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. It's a really powerful time right now in Canadian history to be talking about ghosts, don't you think?
Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah. What are some of your thoughts on what is happening now with the unearthing of, or the not discovery, but the recovery of bodies of Indigenous children? What are some of the things that you're feeling or thinking right now?
I mean, I remember reading I think it was the first article some months ago about the school in Kamloops, which, I mean, I live in British Columbia. I've been here for 25 years. And I was just shocked and devastated and heartbroken. And really at that moment, horrified to, and really asking, speaking of having spoken with the we of nationhood, really asking what that nationhood consisted of, that this was something that that at least maybe within communities outside of indigeneity, that this is something that of which we could all continue and go about our days unaware of. I was utterly horrified. I continue to be completely horrified, and sort of, it's, I think that this is obviously a time where all of these children need to be recovered. There needs to be space for that. There needs to be it's something I'm still processing, but it is something where you really sort of look at the I guess the official history of the nation that you learned about in grade school, and really you see how what we know and our inheritance is really something that is bequeathed to us through story. And in some ways, I would say that the history that I can remember learning in grade school was this was the history I talk about the supremacy of stories in the book. Well, this was the story that reigned supreme. And I don't know if I kind of carried that naivete on into my adult life, but I was just utterly shocked. And I think that that's something that we all need to, I think maybe we're in the midst of it, but just have a collective reckoning about as a nation. This is something that we all need to confront.
Mm-hmm. I was speaking with an Indigenous healer, an Indigenous South African healer, a couple of years ago, and she said to me, the writers, artists are healers as well. And I, at the time I thought, well, I don't know that I see myself that way. It just seems like a really big role. It just felt really overwhelming when she said it to me. But storytelling has, it has the power to heal, right? It has, around the time that Trump was elected, I remember Toni Morrison, I'm sure you remember Toni Morrison writing about how a friend told her that this is the time when we actually, when writers can't sit, there's no time for fear. This is when artists do work. And she said, it wasn't Toni Morrison who said this, but she said her friend told her, we do language, and that is how civilizations heal. I wonder if you've considered that role at all as a writer throughout your career, when you work, if you have thought of yourself as having a role in the healing of the story of Canada, the story of Blackness around the world, if healing is something that comes to you at all as part of your work, or part of how you might define your work.
Yeah, I would say no, that's not, I think maybe if I were to write in the shadow of that role, I would never write. There would just be too much pressure. I would feel it would just be too much. And so I feel like I write from a place of smallness, even as it gets sort of larger and takes on bigger themes. I write on the level of character and situation, and just a curiosity about somebody's particular life. and then wanting to follow that through. And if that gives some balm or some solace or some enlightenment to somebody else, that's great. That's wonderful. But it's certainly not the place that I start from. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But then I have to say that I did find Out of the Sun to be very healing for me at this point. And as I said at the beginning, I felt I was in mourning, but I felt the act of speaking of Blackness and its history in the world, and going back further than last year or further than my lifetime. I found it to be very healing, very powerful. And so I thank you for that, because it was, as I said at the beginning, it was the book I needed. Yeah.
No, that's thank you for that. That's means a lot to me.
Yeah. You are first generation Canadian. And I have lived in Canada 2 decades, and I still find, it's very difficult to fully call it home, but this has been the only home really, right, that you have known. How do you root yourself so deeply in this country when you have these roots in another country and you were raised by people, your parents, who came from somewhere else? How do you feel so anchored? You do speak a little bit about this sort of longing that you had at some point for Ghana growing up, and how you and your siblings always figured that going back would feel like home, and then it didn't quite, right? So how do these two things come together? When I read you, I read somebody who is so deeply rooted here, and so the sense of not belonging doesn't come through as much.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, and even you use the word like to go back to Ghana, which is something that it's like I hadn't been there before, but we did speak about going back as though somehow psychically, spiritually, that was our home, and so traveling there would be a kind of a homecoming. But it was a bit of a rude awakening, I think, for all three of us to discover just how much we had been formed and shaped, and how deeply rooted we were in Canadian culture, in the places of our birth. And it was really surprising to us. I think we were really surprised to discover that. And it was also a bit of maybe consoling, but also a little part of you that believed that you belonged to an elsewhere. You have to resign yourself to the fact that that's not quite so. And so there was some sadness tied up in that first, trip to Ghana, a sense that this, having moved through the world with a feeling of difference, of otherness, but understanding that always beyond the horizon, there is this place in which you perfectly belong. And then to discover that is a fiction to some extent, that is a bit of a mirage. There's always a bit of a death there. But then we could begin to have another relationship with our parents' home country. One that, that's different, but that does, that doesn't sort of completely degrade the connection that you had to it before, or make it smaller. It's just different. It's just a different feeling now that you have. And I guess conversely, maybe you feel more rooted in we felt more rooted within Canada when that door sort of narrowed a little bit. So I think that's probably what if you sense a kind of rootedness here, it's coming out of that. But having said that, I'll say that it's not a perfect sense of home. I think home can be a bit of a construction for some people, and and that includes myself. That it's something that I've had to. It's been a long process. It's been like a decades-long process, and it's home is much rooted in my personal relationships as it is in landscape and love of landscape and an affinity for for certain I guess a certain landscape. It's been a process of building, and I think that's simply how it is for some people, and I've made my peace with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're almost near the end, and I just want to let everybody know that you can send questions if you'd like for Esi to answer before we finish. I want to talk to you a little bit about your writing process. I have to because as a writer, I'm always just really fascinated. But something came up for me in the section about ghosts that made me think, oh, I really need to find this out about her. When you write, where do you begin from? I know. So Alice Walker and Jasmine Ward are the two writers I've read about who say that they feel that they are writing other people's stories. And when interviewed, somebody said to Alice Walker, so is it like a haunting? Like, do you feel like you're being haunted by these characters? Because she had said, well, because they won't let me be until I've written their stories. And Jasmine Ward kind of talks about having this sort of similar experience when she writes. And I was wondering if you come from a similar place at all, or if stories come to you differently.
I wish that I had that sense of a haunting where something, a character or voice can't let me go. It's a much more arduous process of, I think I'm always recognizing that it takes 3 years to write a novel. I'm always disinclined to commit to one thing. And that was kind of the beauty of writing this book, because I didn't have to commit to one thing. I could kind of shift through several stories. I could shift through several geographies and not have to commit for more than 2 months at a time or a month at a time to a certain story. But it's much more of it's a less elegant process, I think, than the one you're describing, of really looking at several stories and maybe trying some voices on and having to cast those off, and then just being miserable for several weeks and not writing anything, and then finally, because the process can't go on, then committing myself to something and then seeing it through. But what's the process like for you?
So I'm similar. I write a bit like that, the way that Alice Walker describes. And I feel that somebody, it feels a bit like somebody comes to me and they tell their story through me a lot of the time. And I do have that feeling of they won't let me be until I've told the story. And so when I was reading the chapter on ghosts, I was thinking about how I've often written things in the past, and then just as a story that came to me, and then the book was published, and then that's it. And then I'll pick up a historical book and a book of history, and I'll read a story and think, oh my God, this is so similar to sort of the kind of story that I was thinking. So I've sort of come to feel like these were real people at some point, because often it feels like somebody who needs to live something through and resolve it, and then at the end, because I don't know if you have this similar experience of feeling such deep sorrow when the book ends.
Yes, I do that. Yeah, I think that getting started is not so much this urgency to tell one story, but once I've settled into the book and once I've really committed to it and I'm writing very hard on it, then it's like I feel so connected to these characters. I feel like I go to bed and I'm dreaming of the characters, and sometimes I have to get up in the night and actually write down dialogue just because everything is still moving. And then I get to the end of every book, and I just feel so emotional. I feel overwhelmed sometimes. I feel. I think, I don't know if this is the thing to admit, but I just remember finishing Washington Black and typing the last line and then just bursting into tears. It was just this feeling of leaving this person behind and knowing that I was done with him and that the end had come and then just this great yeah, I do get very invested, but it's a long process to get me to that place.
Yeah. I feel like they've left, and I feel so sad because you, as you say, you get so invested, and it feels like you're living with someone for a while, and then suddenly they're gone. And so yeah, it can be very hard at the end. We have a question. Someone said, "How do you avoid the research rabbit holes?"
You don't avoid the research, or at least I don't. I let myself go down so many different rabbit holes, and it is time consuming. And that's maybe part of why I spend like a full year researching something before I start writing. But eventually you do have to sit down and actually produce pages. And that's when, you kind of will yourself to set everything aside and get down to business. But I think it's important, at least for a writer like myself and somebody writing historical fiction, to let yourself go down those rabbit holes, because sometimes they lead you to places that you would just never have imagined. And the material something shifts in your perception of the material. And this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't just kind of let yourself run wild. So I highly recommend doing that.
Right. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we finish? It's been such a pleasure talking.
It really has. Okay, so thank you so much. It's been a great interview. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so happy that you came, and we're hoping to see you in the spring. I don't know but we'd love to see many more writers in person. If you're watching, thank you for spending this evening with us. Please check out the Ottawa Writers Festival's website for more events coming up. I wish I could actually have coffee with you and discuss chapter by chapter. We don't have that kind of time. And you're all the way on the West Coast. Someday, I hope we get to meet in person. Esi Edugyan, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, Kagiso.
Thank you.
Thank you all for watching.
Thank you.